Hey everyone, great to see so many friendly faces, and I see lots of faces I don't recognize, but welcome, whether I recognize you or not, it's irrelevant. Um, can you all hear me? Okay, great. Um, Thrilled to have so many people on the Zoom. I'm Brian Faves. I run the Corporate Coalition, which means I could work with people like Steph Dolan, who many of you know, who run our Fair Chance program. Um, this this Zoom, for those who are unsure why it's on your calendar, um, came out of last October's National Fair Chance Hiring Conference that was held in Chicago in collaboration with a number of organizations that are on the Zoom today. One of the ideas in the feedback sessions was to have a regular brown bag lunch where researchers could present either new papers or new findings to a group interested in fair chance hiring and have a conversation about that. So whenever anyone asks you for feedback, be careful. It might end up in a Zoom with 150 people who RSVP'd. I admit I've never run a Zoom with 150 people, so we'll see how this goes. Um, so everyone is aware, the invite list, which is about 400 people, includes the roughly 200 who showed up in Chicago, as well as the other 200 whom we might have talked with in the course of putting the conference together, or we know are interested in fair chance hiring. Um, if you're on this Zoom, that means you're probably interested in this. But please know we're going to continue to communicate with this large group. And if any time this isn't of interest to you, please just pop me an email and say, hey, you can take my name off the list. I will not be offended. I am thrilled there is so much interest in this topic. Um, and so let me tell you just a couple things about other next steps from the conference, tell you about our topics for today. Then I'm going to turn it over to Rob to lead the first conversation. First, for those who are unaware and are interested, the videos from October's conference are posted on the conference website. Those are the keynote presentations, the evening presentation with Ken Oliver and Larry Miller, and the panel discussions. And I put at the top of the chat, you'll see a link to that. I want to give a special shout out and thanks to our faculty and students from University of South Florida, Northeastern University, Franklin and Marshall, and UC Irvine, who have completed their work on pulling together conference concept papers. These are now at a designer to put them into one coherent conference report, which should be out within about a week and a half. So we will send that out to everyone on this list when that is ready. And that's it for the preamble. Our agenda today, we're going to start with Rob Stewart, who's going to present his paper on the accuracy of criminal background checks. We'll ask Rob to take 10-ish minutes to present some high-level findings, highlights from his paper, and then open it up to conversation. So that should take about 20 minutes. Then Amanda Agan is going to talk about some ongoing research and preliminary results about the performance of individuals' records in the marketplace. Again, same thing, 10-ish minutes on what some of those findings are, then about 10 minutes on a discussion. And then we're going to finish up with Steph Dolan is going to present a framework that she and Shawn Bushway and the Corporate Coalition have worked on fair chance hiring as hopefully a way to help provide some organization and maybe a research framework for fair chance hiring. That'll be about 10 minutes, and then I'll take the last couple minutes and just open it up to, is this useful? If so, how can we make this kind of conversation more useful? How often should we have them? I'm going to try to do the conversations after the presentations with people raising hands and calling on people. If that doesn't work and lots of hands go up, or yeah, 106 are on now. Let's do it this way. Raise your hand and put your questions in the chat. Steph is going to monitor the chat, and we're going to play it by ear and try to somehow funnel those questions to the presenters. We'll see how that works. With that, I hope Rob is here because I'm going to turn it over to Rob Stewart to talk about his paper on criminal background. Rob, look at that.
Here. Okay. Hello, everybody. Brian, thank you for the introduction and thanks for getting this all together. The paper I'm going to present today is a paper that was recently published in the journal Criminology. If you want to skip to the end, you can just scan that QR code and take that home and read it on your own if you like. But I'm really excited to talk about the findings for this. So in a recent book, my co-author, which is available in bookstores now, my co-author, Sarah Lageson, describes how the evolution of digital communication and the internet have dramatically changed our ability to access and share criminal records, leading to the expansion of the use of criminal background checks in a multi-billion-dollar private background check industry. With another co-author, I've written in the past about how this expanded access can to criminal records has contributed to what we call this piling on effect of collateral consequences, because these criminal records are not just used then in employment and housing, but also in other areas of social life, like civic participation, volunteering, social screening, and other things like that. Today, background checks are ubiquitous because presumably employers, landlords, and other consumers find this information to be useful when evaluating applicants. For the most part, there's a widespread assumption that background checks, these private background checks, are valid and they're accurate. But in this paper, we seek to evaluate this assumption. So we're going to focus on three main types of criminal records. First, we're going to talk about official state reports. So these are criminal history reports that are produced by government agencies, typically like state police departments or criminal record repository agencies. They are purported to provide a comprehensive account of an individual's criminal history, or at least as it relates to that state. They're considered authoritative, and they're often used for legal and other official purposes. Regulated background checks are what you typically think of when it comes to employment and rental housing. These are, of course, background checks that are produced by private companies. They're regulated, though, by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and they often rely on proprietary databases and linking algorithms. They get data from third-party purveyors and court runners, and they're also required as part of FCRA to have a dispute process in case someone finds an error in their report. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about unregulated background checks. These are also called public data aggregators or people search services. So like if you were to Google somebody, these are the kind of the links that come up. They focus on digitizing and aggregating criminal justice data, but also other public information. So things like property taxes and bankruptcy and social media URLs and things like that. They have very little data quality moderation, typically. So for the current project, we asked, how accurate are private criminal record reports compared to official sources? And how often do publicly and privately sourced criminal records match? To answer these questions, we compare private sector criminal records to official state records for 101 people in New Jersey. For each participant, we requested computerized criminal history reports, which are often called rap sheets, by submitting their fingerprints and an authorization form. And then we ordered background checks from a regulated background check company, or at least the source data for the regulated background check company, and an unregulated data aggregator. We focus on criminal charges and dispositions by first standardizing them using BJS codes, because if you ever looked at any of these data, they're often written in slightly different ways. And then we link them across sources. Okay, so this is just an overall descriptive view of the counts of charges and dispositions by source. So first thing you might notice is that private sources found fewer charges overall. So the regulated background check company found 1,123 charges, whereas the unregulated background check company found 973 charges, and that's compared to the 1,323 charges that were actually found on the state reports. So when we look, importantly though, we should also notice that the private sources found data on fewer people. When we looked at the number of people for whom each data source found charges, we of course found that the state report found data on all 101 app participants, as it should, because every one of these people had at least a criminal charge, a felony level charge or a criminal charge, and most of them had convictions. But the background check company, the private regulated background check company, only found data for 77 people. In other words, if an employer were to run a background check for one of these other 34 people, they'd get the false impression that nearly a quarter of the sample had no criminal history, even though they all had at least one felony charge. The data aggregator found even less, or found an even smaller proportion, but for some reason, the data aggregator reported 58% more overall convictions than the state reports. So here's a more visual comparison, person to person across the different sources. So this bottom row represents the counts of charges as represented by the official state report. Basically, we just sorted them from who had the most charges to the least charges. So the y-axis is the number of reported charges per participant, and then the x is just the different numbers, the different participants. Convictions are darker, dismissals are lighter, and then unknown dispositions are gray. So if we assume that private sector background checks are accurate representations of people's records, as many users or consumers of these records might expect, then we would expect that the distribution of charges would be similar across sources, right? Well, when we look at the regulated background check, we can see that it's really kind of scattered a little bit. In fact, we see that there's quite a few bumps up here, up on the left-hand side, and then you see this person down here who had tons and tons of charges reported on a private background check that were not actually him. The data aggregator was even worse. It's just all over the place. So prior to matching, these are the buckets of charges, right? So the blue circle are the charges found in the state report, the orange is for the background check company, and so on. So this is what it looked like after matching. Only 8% of our charges for our participants were accurately reported by all three sources. 8%. Only 54%, which show up in the big blue circle, of the charges were reported in the state reports were also accurately reported by at least one of the other private sources. So first, I want to highlight false negatives. These are situations in which the private sources fail to report incidents that were found in the official state report. That's this kind of wedge out here. 613 total charges from the state reports were not reported by a private sector source. On the flip side, false positives, or what we're calling orphan records, these are reports of charges that do not appear in the official state report. These can result from things like matching error or data from alternate sources, or cases that have been expunged or whatnot. And so these are all the out of the perimeter of the main state report circle. So this idea of orphan records, it's an idea coming from database management in which records just they appear in secondary sources, but they don't appear in the primary source. And we're not talking about little things here. These are examples of the orphan records that showed up. So things like drug charges, forgery, weapons offenses, assault, murder 14 times, murder and manslaughter, right? So somebody, in other words, applying for a job is getting a criminal history report that says they were convicted or charged with murder, but it never was, that wasn't the actual case. It was somebody else. Overall, we found significant errors in our participants' criminal records. Most significantly, in our view, is that half or more of our participants had at least one of these orphan records on their private sector background checks. So just to kind of sum it up, the problem with criminal records is that they regularly contain errors, they're easily misinterpreted, and they're unreliable tools for evaluating individuals. So I guess you might think, well, what can we do? I think the first thing that we encourage you to consider is whether or not bad and reliable, or potentially bad and reliable data is actually better than no data at all. Or perhaps reconsider the degree to which these background checks affect the decision-making process. Maybe they're still a component, but maybe you couch it in this in the understanding that they may not be truly representative. Second, if you're going to do background checks, we'd encourage you to consider using CRAs that conduct manual reviews of the data. Although they may be more expensive and may sound somewhat antithetical to the current move towards this kind of like automation and AI and all that, having an experienced reviewer apply additional scrutiny to linked records will often lead to more accurate reports. And then finally, if the goal is to get an accurate representation of a person's criminal history, then we encourage employers and landlords and others to shift to official state reports rather than private sector providers. Now, government agencies, they don't use names and birth dates. They use fingerprints or other types of biometrics to link people together. So you're more likely to get accurate, or at least accurate as it relates to what that's a whole nother issue, but accurate in terms of at least you're talking about the same person, right? Now, the issue with that is that in order for this to be possible, policymakers have to be willing to fund these agencies, because this is not necessarily a cheap process, and we have to be able to provide support. But the United States is virtually alone in using private sector type background checks. Almost every other country uses official state reports. So just to close, many of the problems we find in private criminal records result in part from systemic flaws in those data that are collected, matched, and used. These records then kind of become and operate as a kind of Franken data, which is my AI version of what Franken data says. These are assembled from sources that are often unregulated and can be outdated or inaccurate. Now, here's the thing. The consequences for these individuals can be significant, and the burden of these inaccuracies are not evenly distributed. So those with fewer resources can face greater barriers to correcting these errors, which then reinforces the cycles of exclusion and harm. And in a digital world where records persist indefinitely, these problems don't just fade away. They're going to multiply. Thank you all, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
So I'm going to jump in. First, Rob, thank you for being willing to jump in, the first person to provide a paper on our first Zoom call. So thanks for going on a ledge. And couldn't imagine something more pertinent to what this group cares about. There's some questions in the chat. Let me do this. Just people raise their hand. Let's see if we can do it by hands. And if not, we'll go to the chat. Okay, I see no hands. So let me just, Joel, you have a question about different jurisdictions?
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I was just wondering if the error rate is similar across federal and state, and then when you're thinking about a solution, I would assume that it's primarily a state by state solution. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts about what the jurisdiction strategy around working on this problem is.
Yeah. So thanks for the great question. I can't necessarily speak to the different, like the error rates across states. What I can, because we only did this in one state, at least for this paper. We also did this in another state, Minnesota. When we're kind of working, but we did find kind of similar outcomes in that other state. However, it's not super clear. Like we don't have data, or I don't have data on, the degree, the scope in across the various different states, or necessarily the federal government. I mean, one of the things is with the federal government, the FBI reports that they will often get will often be based on these state reports, right? So it's not, so I can't really speak to that. But in terms of a data quality aspect and a kind of a reform for this, in kind of writing up this paper, one of the interesting things we found was there was a whole debate and conversation in the early 1980s about, hey, we're starting to digitize these records, right? And maybe the FBI or the Department of Justice or whoever should really invest in data infrastructure, data quality, and to be sure that these things are produced correctly and maintained and managed well. And of course, that did not happen. And so I think there is, I definitely think there's one way to start this is to take a state-by-state approach. But I think there's also potential at the federal level to provide incentive-based, grant making, or whatever through the Department of Justice to incentivize states to produce better data. And I think, it's probably improving over time. But one of the other things that we found in another state is that some of these reports were also reflective of geographic differences in the data infrastructure of individual police departments and county court systems, right? And so you might have a state in which, like my home state of Minnesota, Hennepin County might have a really well-developed system. And so if you have a case in Hennepin County, an old case, that's going to maybe show up. But if you live in a rural part of the state that was still using paper records, the likelihood of that data showing up is less. So thanks for that question.
I see
Shawn?
a hand up from Shawn.
Yeah, so I just came back from the search.org member meeting, which is the meeting from all the repositories of all the states that create the fingerprint files that are the discussion, including the New Jersey repository. I'm one of the at-large members. For 30 years, it was Al Bloomstein, then it was Bill Sable, and then Jim Lynch, and then finally they lowered their standards, and I'm now the guy. And I think there's a couple of, I think there's more going on here than I think Rob and Sarah seem to be aware of, which is probably fair because there's a lot going on, and then you wouldn't know unless you went to these meetings, and they don't exactly make them public. But there is a large grant program called NCHIP through BJS that works on exactly the type of data correction. When I say large, it's like $80 million a year. That is designed for data improvement in the repositories. And so it is every year about that much money. And they're constantly working on improving. And you can actually see a survey. I put it up in the link. They do a survey every 2 years that get at exactly the questions across across the jurisdictions that they are talking about, that report the things that they're discussing. And they're also building data dashboards that will allow the company, the repositories to look at this more directly. I also think there's an error in what Rob said, and I just wanted to clarify because I know in that Rob said that they're orphans. If they're coming from the court record and it didn't get matched in, that meant they had the wrong person. That's absolutely not true. And it's something that the search guys have been working on and trying to demonstrate. And there's a really big report from Virginia and the Sentencing Commission, which is there are lots of cases that don't start out with an arrest card. And if it doesn't start out with an arrest card, when they go it will be convicted in the courts, but it won't be matchable. But it really does exist. And I did a big study as part of a lawsuit or part of a public service commission where we went and looked into what was going on in Maryland. And those conviction records were actually far better coming out of the court records from Maryland than they were from the state. So I think it is wrong, I think, to say that if it's in the conviction court records that it's an orphan, that means that it's being attributed to someone incorrectly. And I think it's very clear that the repositories wouldn't say that. In other words, there's lots of documentation on that. So just, there's a lot going on here. I'm happy to help people get more insight into it because it is a bit behind the veil, behind the curtain. But I did make the folks aware of your study, Rob, and hopefully there'll be some more conversations and more public discussion about this because they do these kinds of things. Every state that I'm aware of has a group of people that are trying to get these records to match up, and they're well aware of the problems you're identifying. And so trying to figure out how to do that, I think, and maybe being more transparent about what some of those are. But that's survey that I've put up on the chat is a good place to start for cross-jurisdictional content.
Thanks, Shawn. I just want to add, we've talked to Search about this a lot, and just want to verify that everyone understands. Our goal was not to audit differences between the state agencies, and we did manually pull the court records that Shawn's referring to verify the CCH court records. So we covered the courts, and our really analytic question was to look at the private sector. So what we're curious about is how data brokers and private providers, when they're scraping the data, what happens to it? And so Search and the federal government are spending a ton of resources on repositories, as they have to, because automatic expungement is here. And so there's new legislative mandates across many states to update their records. So there's great work happening there. What's not being regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act are data brokers. So there's been efforts by the CFPB to rein in data brokers, but that hasn't happened yet. I don't know if that'll be happening in the short term. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that the focus here is really on these private records and what's missing. And for the one example that
To be clear on that, just to respond to you on that. So the mistake that I'm pointing out is the one that you said, these are things that were in the private records and weren't in the repository, and therefore they're errors. They're not in many cases. They're actually in the court records, but not in the system, and they really do belong to the person. So in other words,
Right.
if you don't find it in the repository, it doesn't mean that the repository is right and the court records are wrong. And that's
Right,
the
which is
only
why
thing I'm
we
talking about.
pulled the court records to.
We also looked through the court records as well to confirm that what we found in the state records were accurate, or in the special reports. But to be clear, when I was talking about orphan records, specifically the orphans that we were pointing out, or that I was pointing out in the graphs or whatever, these are of other people. Like, you can tell when we looked at the actual report. So for example, the one guy that had many not the reports, the actual court records, somebody had used a false an alias, right? That this guy had also used back in like 1988, and it was a similar alias, but it was a different person. And all of that second person's things got put onto him in the private sector report, right? And so I think what Shawn's saying is absolutely correct, except we thought about that as we went through this. And so we tried to take that into account as much as we could. Now, to be clear, we have a whole other thing in which we're going to be looking at the accuracy, or how much we can rely on the actual state data from these repositories, because as Shawn points out, these data are not great either. And in fact, my home, in Minnesota, they passed an automatic expungement, which was supposed to go into effect January 1st of this year. And they ended up having to postpone it at least 3 months because they're having a hard time identifying records that fit the to accurately identify all the records that fit the criteria for automatic expungement, because of this. There's so many errors in the repository's data. And so I think I appreciate the comment, Shawn. I would say I completely agree that every single aspect of this has problems. And so I'm gonna
interrupt. First of all, Rob did exactly what I asked, which is spend not just 10-ish minutes, 10 minutes on the nose. And we wanted conversation, and we over succeeded. There are a number of discussions going on in the chat and good questions, but hopefully if you can't find someone whom you're speaking with, I know Shawn, you and Rob know each other, so you can follow up. Please use me to connect afterwards. But I do want to move us to our second topic, which is from Amanda Agan, who has been doing some cutting edge research on the performance of folks with records in the marketplace. And Amanda, the floor is yours. And thank you, Rob.
We've been doing Zoom forever and I still could not unmute myself. Okay. Now we're here. Okay, cool. You can see my slides? Brian, you want to give me the thumbs up because you're on my screen? Perfect. Thank you so much. So my name is Agan. I'm an associate professor at Cornell University. I've been working along with David Otter at MIT and Emma Rackstra, who's currently a postdoc at UPenn and will be starting at Swarthmore soon. Emma couldn't join us today. She was actually here in October, so I don't have a great and amazing co-author to be answering questions in the chat, so I will not be paying attention to the chat live as Sarah was. So of course, please put in your questions and we'll try to get to them afterwards. But I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing. And so we partnered with a large background check company and a marketplace company to study how the criminal background check adjudication policies of this particular marketplace company impact outcomes for individual applicants who are allowed access to the platform that this marketplace company runs. In particular, this company uses a technology to hide charges from background checks, at least some charges from background checks that they've chosen in advance. And this allows them to automatically clear some candidates who are seeking access to this particular marketplace company's platform. I do want to be clear that both the marketplace company and the background check company at this time have asked to remain anonymous, so I will be clear about that. And there may be some questions that I won't be able to answer for you. You may have your own guesses. You can keep those to yourself, at least for now. Any applicant whose record is not automatically cleared by this tool is subsequently considered by an adjudicator at the firm, and the adjudicator then decides whether to issue a pre-adverse action notice, that is, whether to tell the person that they're likely to be turned down because of their criminal record. And so we ran an experiment with this particular marketplace company, and for 1 year, applicants to this firm were randomly assigned to either be adjudicated through the baseline pre-experiment matrix that the firm was already using to hide some background check charges from an individual's background check, or a treatment matrix that actually hid more charges from applicant background checks. So what exactly did this look like? The blue column, which is the fourth column here, was their this is just a small piece of their original matrix. I want to be clear about the matrix is much bigger and includes a lot more charges. But before the experiment started, this individual firm was saying was hiding vehicle and traffic license and registration charges, misdemeanor convictions, I should say, excuse me, that were more than 3 years old. With the experiment, they hid all of these particular types of charges. That is, the look-back period became basically 0 years. And so you can see that for a subset of charges, this firm relaxed their matrix and potentially allowed more individuals with criminal records access to the platform. And these were mostly vehicles and traffic, drugs and alcohol, and criminal intent charges. We're not talking yet about perhaps more serious property and violent crime. And so what does this do? For some individuals, it's going to hide all of their charges. So imagine somebody applied to this marketplace company, and these were the two charges they had, a DUI and a disorderly behavior conviction. From 5 and 6 years ago, this person's record would be completely clear if they were randomized into the treatment matrix. And so they would bypass manual adjudication and be allowed access to the platform. Whereas an individual in the control group would have these two charges show up and would go through manual review with an adjudicator. There are other individuals who would have, some of their charges hidden under the treatment matrix. And so in control, this individual has 3 charges that are going to show up that need to be adjudicated manually. And in the treatment condition where they'd to be randomized into treatment, they would have 2 show up because the DUI would be hidden under the treatment matrix. And as you can imagine, there's going to be one more group of people, and those are the group of people who only have charges in the control group that were going to show up no matter what. So they're not hidden in the treatment group, and they have exactly the same record show up, whether they get randomized into control or whether they get randomized into treatment. And so, presumably this should allow access to the platform for more individuals with criminal records, particularly those where all of their charges are cleared and they can bypass manual adjudication. And so we have data from 250,000 candidates who applied to this marketplace company between August 2023 and August 2024. We have information on the applicant's criminal history, whether the applicant bypassed manual review by an adjudicator, and whether the firm issued them a post-adverse action. I do not believe at the current moment that we actually have the information on pre versus post-adverse action. That is, we don't know whether there's some people who responded to the adverse action and were not eventually given a post-adverse letter. And then we have some outcomes for these people on the marketplace company's platform, including the number of reviews they've been given and their average star ratings. We do not currently have the text content of the reviews. And we have incidents reported to the company. So that is, we have some information on positive outcomes for these individuals, and we also have information on potential risk and the kind of negative outcomes that employers might be concerned about when they're screening on criminal background checks. So I want to just jump, so that I'm not taking up too much of our time, to how we're going to be showing you these results. And so what I'm showing you here is just how this affected the adjudication process. And so now a vast majority of people who applied to this platform didn't have a charge. Sorry, that's what this previous slide said. So they're not going to be impacted by our randomization. About 35,000 individuals did have a charge. And of course, they can be categorized into one of those three categories that I mentioned before. They either have in the treatment, they would have no charges newly hidden. If they got treatment, they would have some of their charges newly hidden. And if they got treatment, they would have all of their charges newly hidden. And so the experiment, doesn't really affect people with no charges. Those people weren't being adversed to begin with, weren't being issued a post-adverse action and denied access to the marketplace company's platform. Those with charges in the treatment group are less likely to be adverse, right? So about 31% of the individuals in the treatment group are issued a post-adverse action compared to about 34% of those in the control group. So it does do, in some sense, what we thought it might do, which was allow more individuals access to the platform. You can imagine that's going to vary a lot by what their criminal histories looked like. And so for people with all of their charges newly hidden, they're basically, none of them are now being adversed. But do note that few of them were being adverse in the first place, right? Individuals that were going to have all of their charges newly hidden by the treatment matrix were already being adverse at relatively low rates. That is, the adjudicators, once they went through manual review, weren't very likely to issue them an adverse action. For those with some newly hidden charges, we do also reduce the probability that this individual is issued a post-adverse action. And so in the end, this experiment allowed about 600 additional applicants with criminal records access to this platform. And then we can look at what the outcomes look like, both the kind of positive outcomes, whether they actually engage on the platform, how many reviews they have, what their star ratings look like, and also whether any incidents were reported. So you're going to see charts that look exactly like this for each of those outcomes. And we're going to be really interested in comparing the orange bars, the average in the treatment group, to the blue bars, the average in the control group. And so if we look at whether these individuals use the platform at all, right? The individuals who are in the orange bars on the right-hand side, who are directly or partially treated by our treatment matrix, are significantly more likely to actually use and engage on the platform. And so it's not that you're allowing access to a bunch of people who kind of aren't going to engage or aren't going to work. This shows up also in whether they have any reviews. So the individuals in the treatment group are more likely to have reviews, particularly those that had some or all of their charges newly hidden. So they are active and active users and engaged on this particular platform. This is going to show something really similar. I want to make sure that I'm not taking up too much of our time here. We can look at average ratings, average star rating. So this is a star rating, out of 5, as you can imagine. And these individuals in the orange which have more individuals allowed access to the platform with criminal records do not have worse star ratings on average in the treatment group than they do in the control, to the extent that one might be concerned about their productivity or quality. Now, when we look at incidents, what we're going to do is these are incidents reported to the platform. So these could be any kind of trust, safety, whatever it is, kind of incidents that are reported to the marketplace company. We are going to look at post-experiment incidents per 100 reviews, since actual platform use may differ by these particular groups. If we look at the right-hand side, compare orange bars to the blue bars, these are confidence intervals, these lines, to the extent that you know how to interpret them. This would imply that there's really no statistically significant differences between the treatment group and the control group. And if anything, the treatment group actually has fewer incidents per 100 reviews than the control group. Now, I focus here mostly on treatment control comparisons because that's really what we randomize. I do want to point out, for the purposes of discussion, that on the left-hand side, forgetting about blue and orange bars, we can just compare individuals without charges to individuals with charges, right? We do have some information on the individuals, both without charges and with charges. So overall, individuals with charges tend to have fewer reviews and less engagement on the platform, and do tend to have higher rates of incidents per review. However, for the expansion that we made in that matrix, where we relaxed that matrix a little bit more, that did not additionally increase risk or somehow reduce quality of the applicant pool. And so randomly inducing more applicants onto the platform did not lead to reductions in average outcomes or worse average outcomes, and seems to imply that there's at least possibly more room for expansion of access to this platform without additional risk or reductions in quality. But of course, we'd like to see a lot more experimentation to help us gather more information about how criminal records are associated with both productivity and with risk. And this was a relatively small expansion. We'd like to see some bigger ones. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. And like I said, I have not been able to look at the chat live, and so I'm happy to answer your questions either via voice or via chat.
Amanda, there's one. Thank you, Amanda. Another spot on time. So appreciate that. Amanda, there's one. Is it Yolanda night? Why night? About the margins and what significant means.
Sorry, what was the question one more time? What does significant mean?
Yeah.
So it just means that, when we're doing any kind of experiment like this, or, think about, what is the probability somebody's going to vote for somebody in an election? We always have these margins of error, right? And so in some sense, all I'm trying to say, let's go back a slide, is that the control group is within the margin of error of the treatment group. That is, they look very similar, and we wouldn't be able to say with any statistical confidence that they're different, these two, the orange bar and the blue bar. So you see that 3.9 is less than 4.3, but 4.3 is within that margin of error for the average number of incidents in the treatment group.
Yes, I get that. I was referring to the earlier slides where the word difference was used in the between the treatment and control groups. I think it was even slides before this. Yes. So here, significantly more likely to have used the platform post, but these seem like really small margins. So I was just
they are. I agree that they're relatively small. So on the right, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying, so when you use that term here, is this statistical significance? Because I understand what statistical significance is.
Yep.
Are you using that technically here?
Yeah, I should have been clear that I meant here statistically significant.
Okay.
That is similarly here that the blue bar is outside the margin of error of the orange bar. But, this is, if we think about that 52.8% of the control group had any sort of contact, and 55.5% of the treatment group did. So, we're increasing this by about 3 percentage points. Is that big? Is that small? It's not teeny, but you're right. I was referring to statistical significance, and I apologize about not being clear there.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Kelsey had a question about the sample size, and sorry, I skipped over that a little bit too quickly because I was trying to abide by that 10 minutes. But here gives you some idea of the sample size. So we had about 250,000 applicants go through the experiment in total, though a vast majority of those just don't have records, right? So about 211,000 were completely unaffected by the experiment. So we had 35,000 who were actually impacted by the potential differences in the experimental matrix, and here's how those numbers break out. So about 10,000 or so in each of the 3 categories.
Other questions?
Yeah, and I want to say this is still preliminary. We're still, working with the marketplace company to get a better understanding of all of their procedures, to better understand what these incidents are. And how costly they may or may not be to the firm, and kind of other interpretations of this. We also are still early in the data collection. So you saw that the experiment ran from August 23 to August 24. What I'm actually showing you here, and I should have been clear about that as well, is the first 3 months of outcome data. We are continuing to collect outcome data. Obviously, it's only been about 5 months since the experiment ended. And so we're continuing to collect outcome data for a year. And so we'll have final results at some point by the end of hopefully this calendar year. But these are still relatively preliminary. And this is one firm and one experiment. And so we're really excited about this, but we need a lot more of this understanding and a lot more kind of study, both experimentally or observationally, kind of how actual criminal records are correlated or predict various outcomes that employers or marketplace companies might be concerned about.
Final call for questions, comments, or objections. Amanda, thanks for jumping on. It's really cool to see like this research that's ongoing and get a preview in it. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn us over to Steph. Since our conference in October, Steph and Shawn and I have been working on a map and a framework to hopefully help organize some work, maybe help spur some research around fair chance hiring. And I'm going to let Steph talk about it, and we love people's input on this.
Great, thanks, Brian. So I work with Brian at the Purple Coalition and lead our fair chance hiring work. Like Brian mentioned, coming out of the conference in October, we realized just how much work is being done around fair chance hiring, and all of the various like reports, especially the 2 that you heard today, and research that's taking place. And while we all talk about the hiring process, one of the things that we felt like was missing was an actual framework or like documentation of what are the typical steps in the process. What's the typical language that we all use when we talk about those steps? And so the goal and what Shawn and I have pulled together is being able to just put something on paper that shows kind of like what that process flow typically looks like for at a company. And the goal there is, one, we can all start using the same language and terminology. I'll start talking about the process in the same way. 2, I think we'll also be able to then start thinking about where has a lot of research been done, and what have some of those findings been around particular practice changes for various steps in the hiring process. And then 3, like where are there gaps? Where might there be more research needed around some of these steps and various interventions or changes that companies could make to make the hiring process more fair chance friendly. So with that, Shawn, I'm going to share my screen. Would love you to share a little bit about like your take on this and talk folks through it.
So as Rob and Sarah had mentioned in their paper, I had done something similar to what they did way back in 2007 and 8. And, it was like the Wild West compared, and I have similar results to some of what they're finding. And, but it was an environment where there was just a lot of inconsistency and very lack of clarity about a lot of things that are happening. And over the last 15 years, there's been sort of 3 major changes in the government frameworks and regulatory frameworks that really have made the processes more formalized. The first is the EEOC guidance in 2012, and which essentially followed the practice of what New York had on their books since the 70s, and several other states have now made that also in their books. Illinois and California are the 2 that I'm most aware of, I think, Indiana also. The second is there was a great deal of litigation around FCRA, because many of the CRAs were not following FCRA. And there was, I would say $1 billion worth of lawsuits probably going, where FCRA, people following FCRA is much more common now. And it's hard to find the big companies that aren't following FCRA in some way. And then finally, ban the box, where there are various versions of ban the box, but big companies in particular tend to just follow the most stringent version, which is you have to make a contingent offer first, and then you do the background check afterwards. So after listening to these conversations at October, it occurred to me that we kind of have a process now that isn't exactly the same in every place, but is largely following some basic common themes. And it might be useful when we're talking about reform, if we could talk about where we could be more clear about where are we talking about reform and what step of the process. And so we looked at, if you think about the boxes across the top, those are sort of the major steps, right? You have to apply for a job. You can't get rejected unless you apply. And there are, this is something that came up at the conference, that applying for a job and being qualified for the job is actually a big part of the story for people with records, because there are plenty of people coming out of prison that aren't qualified or don't have the necessary degrees or skills. And so getting people to the point where they can apply and get a job is an important part of the process. And then after they get the job offer, there's an initial background check. And this is kind of like triage. It's only based on the criminal history record. And it's usually done with some type of matrix where the CRA is told, hey, look at these. 87% of the background checks are done through CRAs rather than through the repositories. And an outcome for a fair number of people right out of the bat is that they're going to get to keep the job, and they're processed fairly quickly and they're hired. In other words, the background check comes back and says, yeah, there's something on here, but it doesn't hit any of the criteria. You're good to go. But for people who have more serious records or records that appear to be problematic based on the rules of the road that EEOC laid out in terms of the factors they can look at, they are sent something that's called a pre-adverse action letter, which sounds horrible. And we could talk about, well, that's the name of the letter in the FCRA language. It probably, it should be more like, hey, we hired you, we want to hire you, and but we need more information. And oftentimes it doesn't sound like that. And so there's a discussion about how to make that letter better. Some people self-select out at that point and don't go forward. Others challenge the record, the accuracy of the record, as is their right, or through FCRA, or provide additional information that can be used, such as employment backgrounds or rehabilitation, at which point they go into something called an individualized assessment. There are, in New York, we found over 30% of the people that didn't make it through the initial background check for the Department of Health made it to the individualized assessment. I've seen numbers as high as 80% and as low as 5%. So in terms of the flow rate, and then this individualized assessment takes into account more characteristics. Again, it's usually in the back room. It's not being done by the hiring manager. And then there's either a job offer, the person is allowed to keep the job, the offer is rescinded, or another thing that happens sometimes is people are redirected to other jobs within the company for whom where this wouldn't be a problem. And so, in some employers, this may be slightly different. We can move some of the boxes around, but the point was to see if we could capture many of the main themes. And so when we start talking about different reforms, we could be clearer about where we were talking and what step of the process we were talking about. Megan Denver, who's on the call, did a really good job of putting flow rates for the New York study on each of those arrows. So was able to track where people were getting hit through each of those stages. And you could do that with other places as well. And that's another use of this framework, to just understand where the people are getting knocked out, including never applying in the first place because they don't think they're going to get the job. So Brian, did I follow the rules? Please tell me I did.
And we're 3 for 3.
Okay, good.
And there are several on this call, and I won't get all the names, so I won't try, but who have also helped give input. And just for all you know who you are. Thank you for helping input on this. I think just a couple moments for input on the framework. How might this be useful? How could we improve it to make it more useful? Do people see this being used to help drive some research? We're not letting anyone off the Zoom until someone gives us one useful comment that can help improve it. Right. Oh, Roberta, Tony, I see your hand up.
Yeah.
Tony to the rescue.
Hey.
Hey, Shawn. I can't hit you since I'm not next to you. I'm next to you on the screen. John can't be disappearing. No, I love hearing like where the research is going, because there's been a lot of conversation for a lot of years about, offering all these different options for employers to figure out better ways to get the information that they actually need, and not everything under the sun that is gonna, not be useful for what they're trying to achieve. So to see the work being done where an employer is kind of letting folks kind of collect information on how to implement something like that, and to understand how it does really make a change in the hiring scheme is going to be helpful. We need more of those stories to be able to use to influence and change behavior. So y'all keep it up. I don't care how small the sample is. Like, if we can just start collecting the stories and showing some change and some impact, it's going to be helpful. It's going to be helpful. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing a lot of the research that is being done, and especially that the work around the CRAs, because they have been a black box, and also the Wild Wild West that Shawn talks about. It's still for decades. So we know that they need to be reined in. And so hopefully some of this will be really helpful with us making the case for pushing for that to happen. So that's all I had to say.
Thanks, Tony. Brenda, you're going to get the last word before I get the last word here, because we do want to end on time. But my hero and inspiration, Brenda, what do you have?
I know you have a beautiful wife, but I have a crush too. So, I'm just going to say that, for those of us who've been as we've been at it for a while, I'm actually sitting here in my chair, but I should be doing cartwheels, because what this does is illustrate the value added in a process that employers can respect and understand, and move us from a place of doing charitable work, right? And moving it and shifting it to respecting the business of fair chance hiring and how this affects your bottom line. So we're not asking you to, oh, please help us. It's like, hey, here's a process that you can trust. We're speaking in your language. And I think it just helps to advance the work and help people see this population in a way that they deserve to be seen. And so it's a beautiful tool. I am doing cartwheels. I'm going to ask if we could put that on our website, with your permission, and give you all kinds of credit. But this is the thing that we need as practitioners, probably even more so than the employers, but the employers need this as well. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And just to be clear, our goal in putting this up is it's for public use. Like we want people to use it. So by all means, I think there's a copy of it in the email. We'll resend it out. I see, the background check is a really interesting addition to this. So please use it. My clock says we have 1 minute and we're not going to go over. My request to everyone is to please take 40 seconds and put in the chat your thought on how frequently should we keep doing these? If so, how can we improve them? Please just be honest. This is a lot of people's time. And if we're going to get together on a regular basis, it should be valuable to people. So we'll take a look at the chat after you all put it in there. Anyone have a final comment? If not, thanks to everyone who volunteered to present, who spoke up. We'll take a look at the chat and come back to the group. If there's anyone else you think who wants to be part of this, just email me or put it in the chat. We're happy to include them. And keep your eyes out for those conference papers which are coming out in a couple weeks. Have a great day, everyone.